Vienna, 1572. A Habsburg princess, only 38, drew her last breath in silence, her body wasted by years of coughing blood and the slow ruin of disease. She was Katharina of Austria, a bride of Mantua for just 4 months before fate left her, a teenage widow. How could a daughter of Europe's most powerful dynasty end her life in such obscurity? Unmarried, childless, and nearly erased from memory? The story of Princess Katharina of Austria begins in the autumn of 33, in the echoing halls of Vienna. Her birth was not a private event in the way we think of children today. It was a calculated addition to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, the House of Habsburg. Every child born into this family came into the world with their fate already charted, their lives bound to the political map of the continent. Katharina was no exception. Her father, Ferdinand I, was a man shaped by iron duty and ceaseless ambition. At the time of her birth, he had already established himself as king of the Romans, poised to inherit the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. Her mother, Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, came from a lineage equally drenched in bloodlines and treaties. Their marriage had been a political union designed to secure Hungary and Bohemia for the Habsburgs after the disastrous Battle of Mohacs in 1526. For Katharina, this meant that even before she learned to walk, her very existence carried the weight of conquest and survival. A princess in a family like the Habsburgs did not grow up with freedom in her hands. Her cradle stood not in a nursery of lullabies, but in a chamber lined with the ambitions of men. Each of her siblings was a piece of the chessboard, one destined for the priesthood, another for the imperial crown, and many, especially the daughters, for marriages that could secure alliances, calm rivalries, or strengthen claims. The Habsburg daughters were not raised for themselves, but for treaties sealed with rings. From her earliest years, Katharina would have been taught the rituals of obedience and duty. She learned to sit still in long hours of Mass, to bow when powerful visitors arrived, to smile with the calm reserve that conveyed both dignity and submission. The Habsburg court in Vienna was not a place for warmth. It was a place of order, of strict hierarchy, of endless rehearsals of behavior. For a girl, education meant languages: Latin, German, Spanish, Italian, because she might be married to a man in any of those lands. She learned to embroider fine silks and to play music, not to delight herself, but to display refinement that might please a future husband's court. Yet behind the protocol, there was also the silent shadow of inheritance. Katharina was born into a family notorious for its intermarriages. The Habsburg jaw, the fragile health, the constant pregnancies of Habsburg mothers, all of these shaped the fragile bodies of the daughters. The family's obsession with preserving power through bloodlines often came at the expense of the very blood itself. And Katharina, like so many of her sisters, was caught in this web from birth. As a child, she might have watched her older siblings depart one by one. Her sisters were sent away to marry kings, dukes, and princes, each farewell accompanied by pomp but shadowed with tears, for they rarely returned. Her brothers were trained in the arts of rule, the art of war, and the burden of empire. Katharina's own role was clear. One day she too would be sent away. Her life in Vienna was merely preparation, a long prologue to a destiny not of her choosing. The halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna were gilded but heavy. Imagine Katharina as a girl of 10, walking past the frescoed ceilings and the scent of incense, her small footsteps swallowed by the marble floors. She was one among many children. Ferdinand and Anna had 15 in all. But she was not overlooked. Each child was an investment. Each child was weighed and measured for what they could offer to the dynasty. Katharina was healthy, obedient, and of marriageable potential. That was enough to mark her as valuable. But there was little room for personal identity in this machinery. We do not hear of Katharina's laughter or her favorite colors, for such details were rarely recorded for women of her rank, unless they influenced politics. What remains is the outline. A daughter of the emperor. A piece in the family's grand design. Her individuality dissolved into the collective will of her dynasty. As she grew into her teenage years, whispers of her future must have followed her everywhere. Courtiers speculated about where she would be sent, perhaps to Italy, perhaps to France, perhaps to one of the German principalities. Each possibility came with advantages and risks. For Katharina, none of these choices were hers to make. She was watched, evaluated, and positioned like a valuable jewel to be set in another crown. And so, by the time Katharina reached the age of 16, her destiny was sealed. In 1549, she was chosen to be the bride of Francesco III Gonzaga, heir to the Duchy of Mantua. It was not a choice born of love, but of necessity. The Habsburgs sought to strengthen their ties with the Gonzagas, rulers of a small but strategically placed Italian state. For Vienna, Katharina's marriage was a diplomatic maneuver. For Mantua, it was a bond to the greatest dynasty of Europe. For Katharina herself, it was the closing of one chapter and the fearful opening of another. She was leaving the cold, ordered halls of Vienna for a new life in Italy. A land of different language, different customs, different expectations. The girl who had grown up as one child among many in the Habsburg brood was about to step onto the stage of international politics. But as we will see, the role she was meant to play lasted only 4 months before fate intervened with a cruelty that no dynasty could control. In her story, we glimpse the raw truth about the daughters of empires, born into glory, yet often condemned to silence. Their destinies measured not by the lives they lived, but by the alliances they secured. For Katharina of Austria, even from the cradle, her fate was written by hands, not her own. Katharina of Austria did not grow up in an ordinary family. Her father, Ferdinand I, was not just a man of flesh and blood, but the embodiment of dynastic ambition, eventually crowned as Holy Roman Emperor. Her mother, Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, carried the legacy of kingdoms lost and regained through marriage treaties. Together, they embodied what it meant to be a Habsburg, a life where bloodlines were more important than desires, where crowns weighed more than hearts. Katharina's childhood was woven into this atmosphere. She was born into a brood of siblings, 15 children in all, each one a potential bargaining chip in the vast game of European politics. At family meals, conversations were not about the trivialities of the day, but about treaties, negotiations, and the ceaseless grind of ruling lands from Spain to Hungary. For a child, this meant she was raised less as a daughter and more as a symbol. The Habsburg court in Vienna was no playground. Its walls carried centuries of authority, its rooms designed for ceremony rather than comfort. Imagine a little Katharina, her footsteps echoing in corridors lined with tapestries depicting battles and saints. She would have been taught to walk with her back straight, to bow correctly, to display the calm, unflinching dignity expected of a princess. The palace was not her home. It was her training ground. Her father, Ferdinand, was often away, consumed by wars and imperial business. Her mother, Anna, though caring, was a woman pressed by duty, constantly pregnant, and perpetually aware that each child must serve the dynasty. Maternal tenderness existed, but it was framed by necessity. Even lullabies sung to Katharina might have carried the unspoken reminder, you were born to serve the empire. The education of a Habsburg girl was precise and unrelenting. Katharina learned to read and write not for personal exploration, but for correspondence with diplomats and relatives in foreign lands. She studied multiple languages: German, Latin, Italian, Spanish. She absorbed the subtleties of court etiquette, the way to smile just enough without seeming too forward, the way to listen without promising, the way to stand in a room so as to command attention yet not challenge men of power. These were not simply lessons. They were survival strategies. Music filled parts of her days: harpsichord, lute, and singing. Yet even music was not leisure. It was performance. To play beautifully was to demonstrate refinement, to be admired by visiting ambassadors who would one day write reports about her suitability as a bride. Embroidery, too, was no idle pastime, but an exhibition of patience and skill, proof that she could manage the domestic image required of a noblewoman. And always, looming in the background, was the awareness of her siblings. Her brothers carried the burden of military command and crowns. Her sisters were dispatched across Europe like gifts wrapped in silk, exchanged for peace or favor. Katharina must have watched tearful farewells. One sister married off to Spain, another to Poland, another to Tuscany. Rarely did those sisters return. For a young girl, this created an unspoken fear. One day, she too would leave. Her childhood was not a stage of freedom, but a countdown to departure. The court itself was a world of constant visitors, diplomats from France, Italy, and the Ottoman frontier. Katharina would have seen men in foreign clothing, heard languages she barely understood, and noticed the way her elders spoke carefully in their presence. It was here she learned one of the most important lessons of survival. Silence could be more powerful than words. To listen without revealing, to watch without betraying emotion. These were the skills that marked a Habsburg princess as a worthy tool of diplomacy. But Katharina was also a human being. We can imagine that, behind closed doors, she laughed with her sisters, whispered secrets, and played small games to relieve the crushing weight of expectation. Yet even these moments were fragile. Servants watched, tutors corrected, priests reminded them of piety. Joy was not forbidden, but it was always overshadowed by duty. The shadow of illness was never far away. The 16th century was a world haunted by disease, plague, fevers, consumption. Children died young, mothers in childbirth. Katharina herself survived, but she must have seen siblings fall ill, cousins buried before their time. These reminders of mortality pressed upon her the fragility of life, even for those in gilded halls. The empire might appear eternal, but the bodies that carried it were not. By her teenage years, Katharina had become exactly what the Habsburgs required: a quiet, obedient, and well-trained daughter. Her name appeared in whispers across Europe. Would she be matched to a French noble, an Italian prince, a German elector? Each rumor meant that her life was being negotiated behind closed doors, her fate debated in languages she may never have fully mastered. Her parents saw her not as an individual, but as a potential alliance. For Ferdinand, every child was an extension of his empire, a pawn to move in the game against France, the Ottomans, or the Protestant princes. For Anna, there may have been moments of maternal sorrow, but she too understood that her daughter's value lay in the match she could secure. This was the life of a Habsburg daughter. A childhood spent in preparation, not for a career, not for personal dreams, but for a marriage she would not choose. A marriage that would define not only her life, but the balance of power in Europe. Katharina's early years thus reveal the paradox of royalty. She had everything: a palace, fine clothing, endless education, and yet she had nothing. No freedom to choose her path, no voice in her destiny. She was a child bound by invisible chains, groomed to leave, trained to serve, destined to be remembered not for herself, but for the treaty her wedding might seal. And so, by the year 1549, when Katharina turned 16, the time had come. The empire had decided her future. Her hand would be given to Francesco III Gonzaga, heir to the Duchy of Mantua. For Vienna, this was triumph. For Mantua, it was prestige. For Katharina, it was the end of childhood and the beginning of a journey into exile, marriage, and tragedy. In 1549, at the age of just 16, Katharina of Austria was told her childhood had ended. The decision was final, as such decisions always were for Habsburg daughters. She would be married to Francesco III Gonzaga, heir to the Duchy of Mantua. There was no courtship, no whispers of affection, no dream of choice. For her, marriage was an order, and orders were obeyed. Mantua, though small compared to the sweeping lands of the Habsburgs, was no minor pry. Situated in northern Italy, it stood as a fortress of culture and influence, a city surrounded by lakes, ruled by the Gonzaga family for generations. The Habsburgs sought connection with Mantua for both political and symbolic reasons. An Italian alliance strengthened their grip in a peninsula contested by France and the papacy. And a daughter married into the Gonzagas made Vienna's reach seem infinite. The wedding preparations were grand in theory, but beneath the silks and ceremonies lay the cold reality. This was not Katharina's dream. To her family, she was valuable because she was useful. The months before her departure would have been filled with instruction: how to behave in an Italian court, how to address her husband, how to navigate Mantua's customs without offending. She was rehearsed like an actress before her first performance, except the stage was her life, and failure meant disgrace. One can imagine the departure from Vienna, a procession of carriages laden with dowry goods, fine fabrics, jewels, ornaments, all designed to display the wealth of the Habsburgs. Katharina herself, pale and solemn, was dressed in layers of brocade heavy enough to weigh down her youthful frame. Crowds might have cheered, priests might have blessed her, but for Katharina, the journey must have felt like exile. She was leaving not just her home, but her identity, stepping into a foreign city where her name mattered only as a token of alliance. Mantua greeted her with Renaissance splendor. The Gonzaga court was cultured, steeped in art and music, a hub of Italian refinement. Yet to a 16-year-old girl, far from her family, this grandeur could not mask loneliness. Francesco III Gonzaga, her husband, was just 19. He was handsome by some accounts, lively, perhaps even kind. But marriage, at least for Katharina, was not built on love. It was duty, sealed by the church and enforced by the expectations of two dynasties. The marriage lasted only 4 months. But in those months, Katharina lived through the transformation that so many royal women endured. From daughter to wife, from outsider to foreigner, she was expected to adapt instantly, to speak Italian fluently, to manage her new role as Duchess-in-Waiting. She was a stranger in Mantua, surrounded by courtiers who scrutinized her every gesture. Did she walk gracefully? Did she smile appropriately? Did she appear fertile and healthy enough to bear heirs? These were the questions whispered in halls, far louder than anything she might have wanted for herself. Behind closed doors, Katharina must have felt the crushing solitude. Letters to her family, if she was allowed to send them, would have carried the carefully crafted tone of obedience. Rarely could she confess fear or unhappiness. Every word could be read by others. Her marriage was her duty, and even her grief or longing for home had to be hidden. The young couple might have shared brief moments of tenderness. Perhaps Francesco took her hand during a walk in Mantua's gardens. Perhaps he spoke to her with the ease of youth rather than the stiffness of ceremony. And yet these moments, if they existed, were fleeting. Their union was not given time to grow. In the autumn of 1550, mere months after their wedding, Mantua was struck by plague. Francesco fell ill. The disease swept quickly, leaving no room for hope. Within days, Katharina's husband was dead. She was 16 years old and already a widow. The shock must have been unbearable. One moment she was a bride, the next she was a mourner. The court of Mantua, once filled with celebration, fell into mourning. Black draperies covered the halls where wedding feasts had been held. For Katharina, there was no path forward in Mantua. Without a husband, without a child, her role was finished. She was no longer of use to the Gonzagas. The return to Vienna was swift and humiliating. She had been sent as a bride, and now she came back as a failed alliance. Not by her fault, but by fate's cruelty. A carriage carried her across the Alps once more, not adorned with flowers this time, but shadowed by grief. In the eyes of her family, she had become a broken piece on the chessboard. Too young to be powerful, too widowed to be promising. And yet, this was the cruel truth of royal marriages. Women were valued not as individuals, but as vessels of dynastic strategy. Katharina's brief union, 4 months of fragile marriage, was recorded in chronicles less as her story and more as a footnote in the balance of power between Vienna and Mantua. Her youth, her sorrow, her loneliness, all of these were erased by the cold language of diplomacy. What remained was the silence of a young widow, returned to her family at 16, stripped of purpose before her life had even begun. The year was 1550, and the city of Mantua lay under the shadow of plague. The bells that had rung for Katharina's wedding only months before now tolled for the dead. Streets once alive with music and feasting were silent except for the rattling of carts carrying away bodies. Amid this devastation, the life that had been mapped out for a young Habsburg princess collapsed in a single stroke. Francesco III Gonzaga, her 19-year-old husband, was struck by illness. Records describe it simply as the pestilence, the scourge that swept across Italian cities with merciless speed. There was no cure, no defense, but prayer and flight. For Katharina, the nightmare unfolded almost too quickly to comprehend. A bride at 16, she now sat by the bedside of a dying husband she had barely begun to know. The court of Mantua descended into chaos. Physicians whispered their hopeless remedies, servants fled in fear, and priests hurried through last rites. Katharina, isolated by both language and circumstance, could only watch. Imagine the scene: a dim chamber, candles burning against the stench of disease, a young duchess in waiting, kneeling beside a bed where youth and promise disintegrated into fever and death. Within days, Francesco was gone. Katharina, still a child in many ways, was left wearing black veils, the symbols of mourning weighing heavier than the brocade of her wedding gown had ever done. She had been married for just 4 months. 4 months of trying to adjust to a new country, a new family, a new identity. And now, it was all ashes. Her position in Mantua became untenable. A widow with no child, she offered no lasting tie between the Gonzagas and the Habsburgs. In dynastic terms, she was useless. The courtiers who had once bowed to her as a bride now saw her as an unwanted guest. Grief was not her only burden. Humiliation followed close behind. The journey back to Vienna was arranged quickly. A carriage bore her across the Alps, not in triumph, but in disgrace cloaked as sorrow. The road home was long and heavy. She must have stared out at the mountain passes, wondering how life could change so brutally in the space of months. 16 years old, and she had already lived through a marriage, a funeral, and an exile. In Vienna, her return was received with a formality that barely concealed disappointment. Her family, the mighty Habsburgs, had expected an alliance strengthened through her marriage. Now they received back a daughter marked by widowhood, her value diminished by circumstances beyond her control. To the empire, she was a failed investment. To Katharina, it was a wound that would never quite heal. Her days after Mantua settled into a silence that became her defining condition. While her sisters were married off to kings and princes, Katharina lingered in Vienna, a reminder of how fragile dynastic plans could be. She lived in a court where usefulness was the currency of survival. Without a husband, without children, she was sidelined. But the personal cost was even deeper. For a young woman, marriage had been the only acknowledged purpose. Widowhood at 16 was not only a loss, it was an erasure. She was expected to endure, to accept, to fade into the background, while new alliances were forged with other sisters, other daughters. The contrast must have been stark. In the same palace halls, wedding feasts for her siblings continued. Treaties were celebrated, victories recorded. Katharina, dressed in mourning black, became a quiet shadow in family portraits, otherwise full of power and prosperity. Her tragedy was not grand enough to be immortalized, not heroic enough to be sung in chronicles. It was merely sad, and sadness did not serve the empire. Yet behind the silences of official history, one can sense the enormity of her grief. She had been uprooted, cast into a strange land, married to a stranger, and made a widow before she could learn what companionship even meant. Her life was supposed to be a bridge between empires. But it became instead a cautionary tale of how quickly fate could nullify human schemes. For Katharina, there was no fresh start. Other widows of the era remarried, sometimes quickly, to maintain their dynastic worth. But for reasons both personal and political, she refused. This refusal, whether born of trauma, defiance, or simple exhaustion, marked the rest of her life. She returned to Vienna, but she never returned to the marriage market. And so, in the annals of the Habsburg dynasty, her story began to blur. While her siblings etched their names across Europe through marriage and power, Katharina receded into obscurity. Her brief 4 months as Duchess of Mantua became a footnote, overshadowed by the grandeur of others. But the truth of her story lies in its human weight. Imagine a 16-year-old girl robbed of both love and purpose, walking the halls of Vienna with the knowledge that her life had been determined, spent, and discarded before it even began. She was not only a widow. She was a symbol of how fragile and cruel the machinery of dynastic politics could be. Her life after Mantua would stretch on for more than 2 decades, marked not by triumph, but by shadows. Illness, solitude, and the quiet ache of a woman who had once been meant for greatness, but was left with nothing but her own fading health. Katharina's widowhood was not simply a chapter. It was the axis around which the rest of her life would revolve, a wound that shaped her existence until her last breath. When Katharina of Austria returned to Vienna after the death of her young husband, she stepped back into a world that measured her not by her grief, but by her utility. In the 16th century, a widow, especially a widow without children, was rarely permitted to remain idle. For royal daughters, widowhood was often treated as a pause rather than an ending. The expectation was simple. She must marry again, and quickly, to recover the political value lost in her first alliance. But Katharina did not remarry. And in that decision, or refusal, lies the heart of her tragedy. At first, the Habsburg court did what dynastic courts always did. It began to search for another match. Proposals circulated. Names of noblemen and princes floated in the air like chess pieces waiting to be moved. To the family, Katharina was still a daughter of the emperor, a resource that could be used. Her young age made her reusable. 16 was not too late for another start. The Gonzaga chapter had ended, but another could be opened. For Katharina herself, however, the idea of another arranged marriage must have felt unbearable. She had crossed the Alps as a child bride, been thrust into a foreign court, and within months was left a widow, discarded like a broken vessel. To repeat that ordeal, to leave Vienna again, to surrender herself once more to the designs of men who viewed her only as an alliance. This may have been more than she could endure. There are few direct records of Katharina's voice, but silence itself is revealing. What survives are the decisions around her. No remarriage, no new husband, no second alliance. In an age when the personal will of women rarely triumphed over dynastic necessity, Katharina's refusal was striking. Whether it was her own choice or the result of political complications, the effect was the same. She became a useless princess. In the eyes of the Habsburg court, this uselessness was devastating. Daughters were not meant to remain unmarried. They were investments designed to yield treaties, heirs, and power. To live as a widow in her parents' palace was to stand as a reminder of failure, not just her own, but the failure of the dynasty to profit from her existence. Pressure, subtle and explicit, would have weighed on her shoulders. Courtiers whispered, family members hinted. Priests might have spoken of duty. Katharina, however, did not bend. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was the trauma of Mantua. Perhaps it was the rare spark of defiance in a world that gave her no agency. Whatever the cause, she remained unmarried. The cost of that choice was exile within her own home. She was no longer the celebrated bride who had departed Vienna with fanfare. Nor was she the mother of heirs who might secure the future of another throne. She became a shadow, existing at the margins of court life. While her sisters received letters filled with news of power and prominence, some becoming queens, others duchesses, Katharina's story drifted into silence. The Habsburg family, so large and so entangled in Europe's affairs, could afford to forget her. With many siblings, each forging alliances across the continent, the dynasty did not need Katharina anymore. She had failed in her first marriage and rejected another. In the relentless logic of dynastic politics, she was expendable. Yet it is here that her humanity speaks most clearly. To choose or to accept, the fate of remaining unmarried was to step out of the machinery of politics. It was not the path of ambition, but perhaps it was the path of survival. She would not be shipped across Europe again. She would not be bound to another stranger. She would not risk dying in childbirth to produce heirs for a family not her own. In refusing, Katharina may have reclaimed the only fragment of autonomy available to her. But freedom, if that is what it was, came at a terrible price. Without marriage, she had no role. Without children, she had no legacy. Without alliances, she had no voice. She was present in Vienna, yet absent from the story of her family. It is telling that chroniclers of her age wrote almost nothing about her life after Mantua. For the Habsburgs, silence was a way of erasing the inconvenient. We can picture her during these years, a woman in her 20s, walking through the echoing halls of Vienna's palaces, her figure passing like a ghost, among courtiers who barely noticed her. At banquets, she sat at the edges. At ceremonies, she appeared as a name, not as a force. In portraits, when she was included at all, she was one face among many, blurred into the background of Habsburg grandeur. The pressure to remarry never fully left her. Even as she aged, even as illness began to consume her, the whispers must have lingered. But Katharina stood firm, or perhaps simply unmoved. She did not enter the altar again. She did not exchange vows a second time. She accepted, consciously or not, a life of obscurity. And so, while her sisters were remembered in chronicles as consorts, queens, and mothers of dynasties, Katharina slipped into the margins. The decision not to remarry defined her fate, condemning her to decades of loneliness, but preserving, in some quiet way, her sense of self. In the logic of her family, she had become a failure. In the logic of history, she became nearly invisible. But in the logic of humanity, her choice resonates as a fragile act of resistance against a world that demanded her submission. Her life, from this point onward, would be marked less by the expectations of others and more by the slow erosion of her health. For Katharina, refusing a second marriage meant escaping the prison of dynastic duty, only to face another prison, that of her own declining body. Katharina of Austria entered her 20s with a future that seemed already extinguished. The young widow who had once been paraded through Mantua as a symbol of Habsburg prestige now drifted through the courts of Vienna like a faded echo. She had refused, or perhaps been unwilling, to remarry. In doing so, she had stepped outside the machine of dynastic politics. But for a woman of her rank, such a choice was less liberation than a sentence. Life in obscurity, a ghost at the edge of empire. The Habsburg court was not a place that rewarded invisibility. Every banquet, every procession, every diplomatic reception was a stage upon which the family performed its unity and power. Daughters who married well returned in triumph to visit, cloaked in the titles of queens and duchesses. Sons commanded armies or sat on thrones. Katharina, by contrast, became a background figure. She was present, yes, but rarely noticed. When her name did appear in the chronicles, it was in passing, a daughter, a sister, an aunt. Never a central actor, always a shadow. For Katharina herself, these years must have been suffocating. She was housed in Vienna's palaces, where frescoes and marble announced grandeur. But grandeur was meaningless to one who had no role within it. Imagine her walking through the Hofburg's vast courtyards, watching processions march past, the banners of Habsburg dominions fluttering above. She was a daughter of that empire, yet it had no use for her. Her sister's letters may have reached her from foreign courts, filled with accounts of struggles, births, and politics. But Katharina had nothing of her own to write in return. She was not a queen. She was not a mother. She was simply still there. The emptiness of such existence is difficult to overstate. For a woman whose only defined purpose was to marry and produce heirs, to remain unmarried was to hover outside meaning itself. The gloom of her years was compounded by her temperament. Though we cannot know her thoughts directly, contemporaries described her as quiet, reserved, prone to seclusion. Perhaps she had learned early that silence was safer than speech. Perhaps grief had shaped her into solitude. Or perhaps the court, so loud with ceremony and ambition, simply had no space for her voice. Religion offered one of the few outlets available. Like many Habsburg women, Katharina leaned into piety. The 16th century was an age when faith was not only personal, but political. For a woman sidelined from politics, devotion could provide purpose. She attended masses, gave alms, prayed in the shadowed chapels of Vienna. To kneel before an altar was to inhabit a role that needed no alliance, no treaty, only obedience to God. In faith, she may have found a fragment of identity that court life denied her. But even religion could not erase loneliness. Day after day, she woke in chambers that echoed with emptiness. Portraits of ancestors looked down on her, reminders of duties she had failed or refused. Courtiers passed by with only polite nods. Younger relatives grew up around her, already destined for roles greater than her own. Katharina, meanwhile, sank deeper into the margins. These were the years when the body begins to carry the weight of the soul. Katharina was still young, but the stress of widowhood, the pressure of rejection, and the isolation of obscurity began to etch themselves into her health. She became frailer, more vulnerable to illness. Physicians prescribed tonics, but medicine in the 16th century was little more than superstition dressed in Latin. Leeches, herbs, and holy relics could not heal a woman worn down by sorrow. The court did not persecute her. She was not disgraced. She was not cast out. But neglect can be as cruel as hostility. She was left to drift, tolerated but forgotten. To the Habsburgs, she was neither success nor scandal, simply nothing. That quiet erasure was itself a form of cruelty. For human beings, especially those born to the center of power, are not built to endure invisibility. Katharina's years of gloom coincided with Europe's own turbulence. The Reformation tore apart kingdoms, wars erupted across borders, and the Ottoman threat pressed upon Vienna itself. Yet in the chronicles of those storms, her name appears only faintly. History moved around her, but not through her. She was a silent witness to a continent aflame, powerless to shape even her own story. In her 30s, Katharina must have felt the full weight of lost time. Childhood had been preparation, marriage had been brief, widowhood had defined her youth, and now maturity brought only stagnation. There were no more proposals, no more alliances. The family had moved on. She was, in a cruel sense, surplus. And so, the years of gloom stretched on, each one blending into the next. Perhaps she embroidered, perhaps she prayed. Perhaps she looked from palace windows at the streets below, watching ordinary people live lives freer, if harder, than her own. She had wealth, shelter, and safety. But these were gilded bars of a cage. For Katharina, the tragedy of these years was not one single event, but the absence of events. No drama, no triumph, no scandal, only silence. And silence, for one who had once been paraded as a princess bride, could feel like a slow erasure. This obscurity was the soil in which her final tragedy would grow. For as the years dragged on, her body began to betray her. The coughs, the fevers, the wasting sickness of consumption crept into her life. The gloom of her existence would be joined by the shadow of death itself. By the time Katharina of Austria entered her 30s, the shadows that had long followed her life took on a new and more merciless form. It was no longer just grief or isolation that consumed her, but illness. A disease whispered in court records as consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis, crept into her body and began its slow, unrelenting work. At first, it was only a cough. In the drafty corridors of Vienna's palaces, coughs were common, an irritation of the cold winter air or the smoke of countless hearths. But Katharina's cough lingered. It deepened. It rattled in her chest with a sound that unsettled even the most practiced physicians. Then came the blood. Each fit of coughing left stains on her handkerchief, small at first, then darker, larger, undeniable. The 16th century had no mercy for such illness. Physicians could offer leeches, tonics, herbal concoctions, even prayers pressed into Latin charms. None of it could halt the steady erosion of her lungs. Consumption was called the Great Thief for a reason. It stole youth slowly, wasting the body until nothing remained but bones draped in fragile skin. For Katharina, already fragile from years of sorrow, the disease seemed almost inevitable, as though her body had finally surrendered to the weight of her life. Imagine her days in those years, the once proud Habsburg princess wrapped in blankets near a window, her breaths shallow, her eyes hollowed by fever. Servants brought her broth she could barely swallow. Courtiers walked by her chamber with lowered voices, as though death itself lingered behind the door. The palace that had once ignored her now pitied her. But pity was colder than neglect. Consumption was not only physical torment, it carried a stigma, a sense of doom. Families whispered of it as a curse, a wasting disease that marked the weak and the unlucky. In the Habsburg family, where strength and fertility were prized above all, Katharina's sickness branded her as doubly useless. No husband would take her now. No treaty could be forged through her body. She became not only forgotten, but feared, as illness made her a liability. Yet in this decline, there may have been moments of clarity. For years, Katharina had been defined by her lack of purpose, her refusal to remarry, her fading presence in court. Now, as her body wasted away, she confronted the stark truth. She had never belonged to herself. From birth to widowhood, her life had been orchestrated by others. Consumption, cruel as it was, forced her into a strange solitude that belonged only to her. Illness gave her what politics had denied, an identity, however tragic. Her siblings, spread across Europe, heard of her decline. Some were queens, some were rulers, some embroiled in wars that shook kingdoms. For them, Katharina's illness was an echo, a reminder of mortality even in the heart of empire. But no armies were raised for her, no treaties written. Her suffering belonged to the private sphere, a matter of family and silence, not of history. And yet, the symptoms were relentless. Nights filled with fever, sweat soaking the linens. Days punctuated by violent fits of coughing that left her trembling, exhausted. Her appetite dwindled, her body shrank. In portraits of other Habsburg women, we see the round faces, the rich gowns, the symbols of plenty. Katharina's reality was the opposite, a slow vanishing, her figure consumed by disease until she seemed to fade into the background of her own life. The court, with its endless ceremonies, continued around her. Weddings were celebrated, treaties signed, wars fought. Musicians played in the great halls, candles burned for feasts. The empire moved forward. But Katharina was absent. She could not sit through long banquets, could not join processions. Her life narrowed to the four walls of her chambers. She became, in essence, a living ghost. There is something profoundly cruel in the timing of her decline. In her 30s, Katharina should have been at the height of her womanhood, perhaps raising children, influencing politics, or at least securing her place in the dynastic fabric. Instead, she wasted away, trapped in a body that betrayed her, denied even the dignity of a role. Her refusal to remarry had exiled her politically. Consumption now exiled her physically. The people of Vienna may have spoken of her in whispers. The sick princess, they might have called her, a reminder that even Habsburg blood could not shield one from suffering. In a world where royal women were celebrated for their fertility and strength, Katharina embodied the opposite: barrenness, frailty, decline. To live with such labels was a torment equal to the disease itself. And still, she endured. Year after year, coughing, bleeding, wasting, surviving. Consumption was a slow killer, and its cruelty lay in its patience. It gave her time to reflect, to watch, to feel each layer of herself being stripped away. Time, which for others meant opportunity, meant for her only prolonged suffering. By the end of the 1560s, Katharina was a figure of quiet despair. 35 years old, yet her body resembled that of someone decades older. Her hair thinned, her skin paled, her strength dwindled. And still, she remained unmarried, childless, forgotten. The empire had long since moved on from her story. She was a footnote even before she died. But her decline carried a message written in flesh and blood. Power could not protect against fate. The Habsburgs, with all their crowns and armies, could not save a daughter from the slow ruin of disease. Katharina's body became a testament to the limits of empire, a reminder that mortality humbles even the mighty. Her cruel disease was not merely an illness, it was the final shaping force of her life, the sculptor of her fate. It erased the possibility of redemption, locked her in chambers of weakness, and prepared the stage for her final act. A death as quiet as her life had become. The winter of 1572 in Vienna was long, cold, and merciless. Snow drifted against the palace walls, muffling the sounds of the city. Inside, in one of the quieter chambers of the Hofburg, Princess Katharina of Austria lay dying. She was only 38 years old, but her body carried the weight of decades of sorrow and illness. For years, consumption had wasted her frame. The coughs had become deeper, more violent, each fit leaving her gasping for air, blood staining her handkerchiefs. Servants, by now accustomed to the routine of her decline, hovered at the edges of her chamber. They offered broth, adjusted pillows, whispered prayers, yet everyone knew these gestures were futile. Consumption gave no reprieve. It consumed not only the lungs, but dignity itself. Katharina's final days were marked not by grand rituals, but by silence. Unlike her sisters who became queens, surrounded by courtiers and ambassadors even in their last moments, Katharina died in relative obscurity. No great funeral preparations were made while she still lived. No chroniclers filled pages with anxious updates about her condition. Her fading life seemed almost invisible to the empire she had once been born to serve. And yet, death is always intimate. We can imagine the chamber. A dim fire burning against the cold, tapestries sagging on the walls, a crucifix hung above her bed. A priest sat nearby, murmuring the prayers of the dying. Katharina, once a princess paraded as a bride, now a shadow of her former self, breathed in shallow gasps, each one a reminder that the body was finally breaking beyond repair. What thoughts filled her mind in those last hours? Perhaps she remembered Mantua, her short-lived marriage to Francesco, a boy husband she had hardly known before death tore him away. Perhaps she thought of her sisters scattered across Europe, queens of Spain, Poland, Tuscany, lives more vivid than her own. Perhaps she thought of her refusal to remarry, the choice that condemned her to invisibility, yet spared her the ordeal of another loveless union. Or perhaps, in those final hours, she thought of nothing at all. Illness has a way of stripping thought itself, leaving only the bare will to breathe. On February 28, 1572, Katharina of Austria died. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, no parades of mourning. Her death was not a crisis for the Habsburg dynasty. She left behind no husband, no heirs, no treaties to unravel. The empire continued, undisturbed, as though she had never been there at all. This, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of her end. Invisibility followed her even into death. She was buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, the resting place of emperors and empresses. But her tomb was one among many, soon overshadowed by more illustrious names. For a woman born into the most powerful family in Europe, her end was startlingly quiet. And yet, within that silence lies the essence of her tragedy. Katharina's death reflected the life she had lived. Unnoticed, overshadowed, forgotten, she was not a victim of scandal or conspiracy, not the centerpiece of a dynastic struggle. She was a victim of neglect, of the cruel machinery of politics that had no place for a woman who did not fulfill her use. The people of Vienna likely heard of her death in passing, a brief notice whispered among court news. Perhaps some pitied her, the sickly princess who had wasted away. Perhaps some barely registered her name at all. After all, by 1572, the empire faced greater concerns: wars, reforms, the vast machinery of state. Katharina was not a figure who altered history. She was simply gone. And yet, her death reveals something history often hides: the cost of dynastic politics on the human soul. She had been born into glory, married into strategy, widowed into silence, and finally consumed by disease. None of these stages were chosen. None belonged to her. Death, in its finality, was perhaps the only moment that truly did. Her funeral was modest compared to the grandeur afforded to her siblings. There were prayers, a procession, the lowering of her body into the crypt, but no nation wore black. No bells tolled across Europe. Her passing was not marked as a loss of empire, but as the closing of a quiet, tragic chapter. For those who stood at her bedside, however, the moment must have carried weight. The last breath of a Habsburg daughter was still a reminder of the fragility of all flesh, even royal flesh. A dynasty that commanded kingdoms and armies could not protect a single woman from the slow ruin of tuberculosis. In her stillness, the empire saw its own mortality reflected. Katharina's silent death at 38 was not spectacular, but it was profoundly human. It stripped away the illusions of grandeur and left only the reality of suffering. She was not a queen, not a mother, not a political triumph. She was a woman who lived, endured, and died. Her story nearly erased by the very dynasty that shaped it. In this way, her death was not only the end of her life, but the culmination of her invisibility. To be born into power yet die in obscurity is its own kind of tragedy, one that lingers in silence, echoing long after the bells have stopped. The death of Katharina of Austria in February 1572 barely rippled the waters of European history. A daughter of the Habsburg dynasty was gone, and yet the empire did not pause. There were no wars to settle because of her absence, no treaties undone, no dynastic crises. She left behind no children to inherit her name, no widower to mourn her publicly, no political vacuum to be filled. For the Habsburgs, her death was not a disaster. it was a silence. She was buried in the imperial crypt of Vienna, a place reserved for emperors, empresses, and their children. The Capuchin church, austere in its design, held her body among those of her family. The tombs of the Habsburgs would, over the centuries, become crowded with names etched in marble. Charles V, Maria Theresa, Franz Joseph, and many others who carried the weight of empires. Katharina's name was among them, but overshadowed. Her burial was correct, respectful, but unremarkable. There was no lavish ceremony recorded, no extended mourning. A mass was held, her body placed in its resting place, and the court moved on. Within days, perhaps even hours, attention shifted back to the pressing concerns of empire. Wars against the Ottomans, negotiations with Protestant princes, the unending demands of rule. Katharina had played no central role in those affairs, and so her absence was not felt. This is how dynasties forget. Not through deliberate cruelty, but through the machinery of power that remembers only the useful. Katharina's sisters were remembered because they bore children who shaped the future of kingdoms. Her brothers were remembered because they ruled, fought, and signed treaties. Katharina, who had refused to remarry and who died without heirs, was simply set aside. Even her grave tells the story. Visitors to the imperial crypt in later centuries linger over the grand sarcophagi of empresses adorned with sculpted crowns, over the Baroque monuments of emperors carved with triumph. Few stop to notice the plain tombs, the smaller names. Fewer still notice Katharina's, tucked away, almost invisible among the glittering memory of her family. In genealogies, her name appears as a line, a date of birth, a date of death. No great deeds, no titles, no legacy. She is a reminder that history often remembers only the loud, the powerful, the triumphant, and forgets the quiet tragedies. But what of those who lived near her in Vienna? Did anyone remember Katharina with affection? Perhaps servants who tended her in illness, perhaps a confessor who heard her whispered fears, perhaps distant relatives who pitied her suffering. For them, her death may have carried weight, but theirs were not the voices that wrote chronicles. Their memories vanished like smoke. The irony is that Katharina's death coincided with an age of intense remembrance. The 16th century was a time when royal funerals were theatrical displays of power, carefully staged to affirm dynastic strength. Coffins draped in velvet, streets lined with mourners, sermons printed and distributed across Europe. These were the tools of memory. Katharina received none of that. Her funeral was quiet, her passing barely noticed. And so, the aftermath of her death was not grief, but erasure. The Habsburgs did not dishonor her. They simply forgot her. She became one of many daughters whose lives ended without consequence to the empire. This forgetting, however, was not only political, it was cultural. Unlike other royal women who inspired portraits, poems, or monuments, Katharina inspired nothing. Artists did not paint her on horseback or draped in finery. Historians did not linger over her story. She was too ordinary in her tragedy, too silent in her suffering. Centuries later, when scholars look back at the Habsburg dynasty, Katharina's name appears rarely, often only in footnotes. She is overshadowed by her more famous relatives. Her father Ferdinand I, her brother Maximilian II, her sisters who became queens. In this way, her story reflects the fate of countless women of her age, remembered not for themselves, but only in relation to others. And yet, in the quiet of her forgotten aftermath, there is something haunting. For Katharina embodies the countless lives erased by the machinery of history. She represents the truth that not every princess lived a grand life. Not every Habsburg was a figure of destiny. Some, like her, were simply carried along by the tides of politics, discarded when they offered no advantage, left to fade when illness claimed them. In the centuries that followed, her tomb remained in Vienna, visited only occasionally by those tracing the long lineage of the Habsburgs. Tourists and scholars passed by without pause. But her presence, silent and enduring, whispers still from the shadows of marble. Katharina's forgotten aftermath is not unique, but it is emblematic. It reveals the cost of dynastic politics, not only in the lives that were sacrificed for alliances, but also in the lives erased by neglect. Her fate tells us that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not violent death or scandalous fall, but simply being forgotten. She had been born into the center of power, yet she died as though she had never existed. That paradox, that erasure, is perhaps her true legacy. In being forgotten, she reminds us of how fragile memory can be, how history itself often chooses silence over sympathy. Katharina of Austria, princess, widow, invalid, forgotten, remains in the imperial crypt, her story hidden among stone and dust. The empire that once shaped her life has long since vanished. But her quiet tragedy lingers, if only for those willing to pause, look closer, and remember. Katharina of Austria's life closes not with the thunder of power, but with the quiet toll of sorrow. She was born into a dynasty that ruled vast lands and commanded armies, yet her own existence was defined by absence. No long marriage, no children, no legacy carved into the chronicles of Europe. What remains is not triumph, but silence. And yet, within that silence, her story resonates. Katharina embodies the hidden cost of empire. The daughters who were traded as pawns. The women whose worth was measured only by alliances and heirs. The lives erased when they failed to serve the machinery of power. In her suffering, we glimpse the humanity often stripped away by dynastic politics. Her tragedy was not spectacular, but deeply human. Loneliness, loss, and illness endured in obscurity. And perhaps that is why her story matters. For every monarch remembered in stone, there were countless others like Katharina, whose names were nearly forgotten, whose pain was real but unrecorded. To remember her now is to honor not her dynasty, but her humanity. A young woman caught in currents stronger than herself, who endured quietly and whose silence speaks still across the centuries.